I wasn't supposed to find this. It was raining hard the day I broke into the archives. The storm had been gnawing at the roof of the old county courthouse for hours, the wind pressing the smell of wet stone and paper into every corner of the place. My shoes left muddy crescents on the warped floorboards, but no one was left to scold me. This wing hadn't been staffed in decades. The door to room 6E shouldn't have opened, not without the brass key they kept chained in the sheriff's office. But the lock was rusted enough that the flathead screwdriver slid in and turned like it was tired of keeping secrets. Inside, it was all humidity and dust, the air almost sweet with mold. Stacks of ledger books leaned against each other like drunks at closing time, their spines cracked, their pages swollen from years of damp. Light from my phone cut across the dark, catching on threads of spider silk that swayed in the draft. It was the ledger at the bottom of the stack that drew me. Its cover was a deep, almost oily black, with no title or label. I pried it free and brushed away a film of dirt. My fingers left 5 pale prints against the dark leather. The first page was neat, handwritten in tight, old-fashioned script. No date, no location, just a name, a hollow doctrine below it, an index of entries. The list was clinical, like inventory, but each line carried a peculiar chill. Case 22, the Thorn Pair Case 48, the Weaver Children Case 53, M/J, shared parentage. There were more, dozens, but the handwriting wavered near the bottom, and a streak of something brown and brittle had bled across the paper. When I flipped forward, many of the pages had been savagely blacked out in ink so dense it had eaten through the paper. In some, the redaction was so violent the surface was torn away entirely, leaving holes where words should have been. But certain fragments escaped the erasure, born under one roof. Kept from public record. Doctrine observed without exception. In the margins of one page, barely legible in faded pencil, was a single number, 1124. It appeared again, scratched faintly into the leather of the back cover, and again, carved into the wall behind the shelf where I'd pulled the ledger. The rain outside seemed louder now, like it was trying to drown out the sound of my breath. When I tried to close the ledger, something small and folded slid free from between the pages. A letter, the paper so thin it felt like it might dissolve in my hands. No salutation, no signature, just 3 lines, written in an uneven hand. If they learn you've seen this, they will come. If they come, they will not leave. Bury it where even the ground forgets. I stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in my grip. The courthouse seemed to hum faintly, as if something in its bones had woken up. I should have left. I should have put the ledger back where it had been, locked the door, and walked out into the rain without looking back. But the number kept burning in my mind, 1124. I didn't know why, but I felt certain that if I found its meaning, I'd know why someone had tried so hard to erase these records. And maybe, I thought, I'd understand why they hadn't erased them all. The number 1124 took me 2 days to trace. It wasn't a date. It wasn't a case number in the county court system. But buried in the digitized archives of the State Education Department, there it was, Institution ID 1124. The St. Augustine Home for Instruction and Moral Care. Officially, it was listed as an early 20th century church-run boarding facility for morally at-risk youth, established in 1903 and closed, on paper, in 1974. I'd driven past the property dozens of times without noticing it. The main building still stood at the edge of Route 19, just past the old mill. From the road, it looked like a grand but exhausted boarding school, limestone facade, bell tower, rows of shuttered windows like eyelids clenched tight. The founding figure, Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Varro, was a man the local papers once called a saint in shoe leather. Photographs showed him tall, broad-shouldered, his clerical collar always pressed, his eyes steady and unreadable. He'd served on the State Board of Welfare, written pamphlets on the dangers of hereditary vice, and delivered speeches in which he referred to St. Augustine as a place where the corrupted may be cleansed of the rot passed through blood. The state's own records painted the home as a model institution. They claimed every youth placed there had left better equipped to face the moral challenges of life. There were grainy black and white photos of smiling children in tidy uniforms, standing in rows with their hands clasped. The captions were vague. No names, no dates. But the more I searched, the more those official records began to feel like stage dressing. From the county birth and death ledgers, a pattern emerged: children admitted to St. Augustine stopped appearing in public documents altogether. No graduation records. No marriage licenses. No death certificates under their birth names. It was as if, once they passed through the wrought iron gates, they dissolved into the institution itself. In a forgotten corner of the microfilm room, I found an article from 1958, small, buried on page 9 of the Canton Gazette. The headline read, "State questions St. Augustine transfer practices." It mentioned unregistered relocations, improper adoption procedures, and disciplinary programs outside state purview. The investigation, it said, had been amicably resolved after Reverend Varro met privately with the governor. Through an old parish contact, I got hold of a former groundskeeper named Ellis, now 82 and living alone in a one-room apartment above a hardware store. His voice was a sandpaper whisper, and he flinched at every creak of the floorboards. They didn't run that place for the Lord, he said. They ran it for themselves. The children, they weren't allowed to leave unless they were picked. And the ones picked, well, they didn't come back. When I pressed him on what picked meant, he stared at the window for a long time before answering. Some were adopted. That's what they called it. But they kept the names quiet. You know why? He leaned forward, close enough that I could smell the old tobacco on his breath. Because they were adopted by their own blood. Brought back in by the same families they were taken from. The doctrine said it fixed what was broken. He wouldn't say more. That night, I went back to the public records, cross-referencing names from the ledger with what I could find of St. Augustine's intake rolls. The matches were exact. Case 53, M/J, shared parentage, belonged to the home. And there were more like it. The hollow doctrine wasn't just a phrase. It was a policy. The further I dug, the less the people in St. Augustine's records seemed like people at all. Their names, if they appeared, were often abbreviated to a single letter M, J, L. or replaced with assigned numbers, as if individuality were a contagion that needed containing. Birth dates were reduced to spring or winter, years omitted entirely. In a locked cabinet at the county archives, one the clerk let me into only after I swore I was doing genealogical work, I found a stack of letters allegedly written by successful graduates of the home. They were dated decades apart, but the phrasing was identical, almost mechanically so. I am happy and grateful for the guidance of Reverend Varro and the staff. I know now who I am meant to be, and I look forward to serving my family as the doctrine teaches. Every signature was the same looping hand. Even the smudges on the paper matched, as if the letters had been traced or pressed from the same master sheet. But it was an interview, if it can be called that, that began to make the doctrine's cruelty tangible. Her name, when she introduced herself to me, was Elsie. That's what her caretaker, a soft-spoken middle-aged woman named Ruth, called her. But halfway through our talk, Elsie paused and frowned. "That's not my name," she murmured, eyes darting to the wall. "I had another one." I asked what it was. She squeezed her temples, breathing fast. It started with a, she stopped. Her hands began to tremble. "They told me it was wrong. They told me if I said it again, I wouldn't get to stay." "Stay where?" I asked. She stared past me and said nothing else for the rest of the visit. Ruth told me Elsie had been at St. Augustine from 1959 until its closure in '74. When the state transferred the remaining children to foster care, she was 14, but she had no memory of the first 10 years of her life, not even her parents' faces. She remembers the rules, though, Ruth said. She still lines up her shoes under her bed at exactly the same angle. She says prayers to someone she can't name. She still won't celebrate her birthday because she says the day doesn't exist anymore. Later, in the property's overgrown courtyard, I found the stone memorial wall the church had put up after the home's supposed closure. It was meant to honor all who passed through these halls, but every name was gouged out, the carved letters reduced to ragged craters. Only faint traces of the original inscriptions remained, half a surname here, a crooked initial there, like ghosts trying to speak through vandalism. On the second floor of the main building, behind a warped door, I discovered a gallery of oil portraits. Each canvas depicted a child in a St. Augustine uniform, hands folded neatly in their lap. But the faces were the same. The same set jaw, the same flat eyes. As if individuality had been painted over with one acceptable template. In the farthest corner, under a moth-eaten drop cloth, was a small frame. I lifted the cloth and froze. The child in the portrait had a scar above the left eyebrow, one I'd seen before. It matched exactly a photograph from the Ledger's Case 53. The placard below read, J. Successful completion, 1963. The doctrine hadn't just erased names. It had erased the self. The main building of St. Augustine had been gutted long ago, at least, that's what I'd been told. From the front hall, you could see daylight through broken windows, and pigeons nested in the rafters. But as I wandered deeper, the light thinned, the air grew heavy, and the walls began to sweat. In the old chapel, a half-collapsed altar concealed a trapdoor. The hinges shrieked when I pulled it open, and the smell that surged out was so dense and sour it felt alive. I dropped my flashlight through first, the beam fell before finally striking concrete. A narrow staircase clung to the wall like a spine of stone, leading down into the dark. The sublevels weren't in any blueprint I'd found. They were older than the rest of the building, arched corridors of rough limestone, mortared with something that glittered faintly under the light. The first chamber I entered was circular, the walls lined with hooks and heavy leather straps. In the center stood a steel chair bolted to the floor, its armrests worn smooth where hands had gripped too tightly. The walls were painted in wide bands of black and cream, but the paint had bubbled and split, revealing layers beneath shapes like crude halos, painted over again and again. On a warped wooden table sat a stack of journals. The earliest entries, written in Barrow's angular hand, spoke clinically of corrective measures. Subject requires full silence for 72 hours. Voice will be erased of its defects. Later entries became erratic, paranoid, the noise comes from within them. Must go deeper. Light teaches the wrong things. Take it away. Beside the journals was a box of photographs, sepia and black and white, curling at the edges. They showed children lying in coffin-sized compartments, blindfolded, hands bound. In some, attendants poured a dark liquid into their mouths from unmarked bottles. When I tried to leave the chamber, the corridor had shifted. The staircase I descended was gone, replaced by another hallway that curved sharply right. I told myself it was my sense of direction faltering in the dark. The new hall ended in a row of tall, narrow doors. Each bore a small square window at eye level, clouded by grime. When I wiped one clean, I saw only blackness inside until a faint reflection resolved. Not mine. The face staring back had my features, but older. My own eyes, but hollow, as if something had been scooped out from behind them. A slow breath fogged the glass from the other side. I stumbled back and found the stairwell again, though it twisted now, bending left, then right, then feeding into itself like a Mobius strip. My flashlight flickered. Somewhere below, I heard the thin strike of a match. A candle flared to life in the chamber I'd just left. Then another. And another. The flames burned steady despite the damp air. I climbed faster. The walls grew slick beneath my hands, and when I looked down, the moisture streaking my palms was dark, thick as rust, warm as breath. When I finally emerged into the chapel, the trapdoor slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the pews. The first time I went below St. Augustine, I told myself it was just to map the foundations. But foundations shouldn't breathe. The service elevator in the east wing had been sealed since 1974, a panel of plywood nailed over the doors. I pried it off, expecting an empty shaft. Instead, the doors parted with a reluctant groan, revealing a cage still suspended on freight cables. A tarnished brass plate read B to 4, though the building had only 3 floors. The button 4B was worn to a dull crater. When I pressed it, the cage jolted, lurched down, then settled with a thud. The gate opened onto a corridor that didn't exist on any blueprint. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low, and the air had the thick, stale tang of extinguished candles. The floor sloped downward into a network of branching halls, some narrowing until they were barely wide enough to turn sideways. In one chamber, the floor fell away entirely into an open shaft where stairs spiraled down and up. The 2 spirals fed into each other like a knot, their steps warped and smoothed from generations of feet, yet leading to no discernible destination. I found rooms with no doors, just windows set into the stone at shoulder height. Inside, shapes moved in the dark, but when I shone my flashlight through, the beam bent, sliding away from whatever stood there. The central vault was a square room with walls tiled in white porcelain, cracked like dried riverbeds. Along one wall were steel compartments the size of bathtubs, each with a hinged lid. A few were still open, lined with thin, stained cushions. Scattered on a central table were artifacts: leather blindfolds stiff with age, glass vials with residue the color of old honey, a copper basin streaked with something black. Beside these lay a ledger in Reverend Vero's meticulous script: Day 6, full silence. Subject resists remembering. Day 14, remove light entirely. Voice now compliant. Some pages bore dark thumbprints, as if someone had been turning them with wet hands. Then there were the photographs, sepia and gray, the borders scalloped. Children lay inside the compartments, eyes covered, tubes running from glass bottles into their mouths. In one image, the attendants stood smiling faintly, their faces too blurred to name, though the hands were perfectly clear, pale, long-fingered, nails sharp enough to catch the light. It was in the mirrored chamber that I stopped pretending this place obeyed natural law. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, but my reflection lagged behind me, blinking a half-second later than I did. When I whispered, "Who are you?" it whispered back in a voice that wasn't mine, older, deeper, frayed with dust. Somewhere in the corridors beyond, a candle flared. Then another. The flame swayed, though no air moved. When I turned back to the mirrors, my reflection was gone. Only the room remained, empty but for me, and yet the glass was still fogging, as if something stood inches away on the other side. The elevator was exactly where I'd left it when I stumbled back into the first hall, but when the cage rose to the ground floor, the brass plate had changed. The warn button now read B2. And my palms, slick from gripping the gate, were streaked not with dust, but with something dark and warm. I thought St. Augustine was the wound. It was only the scar. While combing through the ledger's later pages, I noticed symbols in the margins, small hand-drawn marks shaped like an open eye inside a teardrop. At first, I assumed they were Vero's private shorthand, but when I photographed one and ran it through an archival symbol index, I found the exact same image stamped in the corner of a 1931 intake record from Our Lady of Perpetual Instruction, a girls' home in Minnesota. The deeper I searched, the more the map expanded. In an unmarked drawer at the county records annex, I found a rolled vellum map, brittle enough to flake in my hands. It showed the continental United States in 1952, marked with 27 small black circles. Each was labeled with a number and the name of an institution: 1124, St. Augustine Home for Instruction and Moral Care, OH; 1130, Our Lady of Perpetual Instruction, MN; 1142, the Harrogate School for Corrective Development, PA, and on, stretching coast to coast. The handwriting on the map was the same as the ledgers. I pulled transfer records from state microfilm and cross-referenced them with the intake logs from St. Augustine. Dozens of students had been moved across state lines with no legal documentation. Some were listed as deceased at one facility and alive at another within weeks. The rituals were identical. Every institution had a doctrine room with the same white porcelain tiles and coffin-sized compartments. Every intake photograph showed the same composition: child in uniform, hands clasped, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. And always, the open eye and teardrop emblem appeared, carved into wood, embossed on stationery, etched faintly into metal bed frames. It wasn't just buildings. A fragment of correspondence, wedged between ledger pages, carried a wax seal, and I surrounded by 5 narrow lines radiating outward. Beneath it, in ornate script, Order of the Fifth Veil. The letter's contents were chillingly procedural: transfer complete. Fifth Veil protocols enacted. Subject's bloodline confirmed. Return to origin after 9 months to ensure sealing. There it was again, the return to origin. The adoption by one's own blood. The doctrine wasn't an eccentric cruelty of one man, it was the arm of a network. The connection to my family came without warning. In the 1968 St. Augustine Register, I found the name H. Calhoun, age 6. I almost skimmed past it, until I remembered the brass nameplate on my grandmother's hope chest: Henrietta Calhoun, 1962. The photo in the register matched the one in my grandmother's sewing room, a little girl in a stiff collar, looking almost serene. But here, she was numbered 1124 to 31, not named at all. I called my aunt, careful not to say why. When I asked about Grandma's childhood, she said only, she never talked about before she came to live with her aunt. Said her birthday was wrong, though. Said it twice, then she stopped. I didn't tell her about the emblem I'd found engraved under the chest's lining. It was the open eye and the teardrop, small enough to be overlooked. St. Augustine was gone, but the fifth veil wasn't. And if their records were right, their blood ran in my family. The last key was hidden behind the chapel altar, taped beneath the carved wooden lip where Vero's sermons once thundered. It didn't fit any of the locks I'd found until I reached the door marked with the fifth veil emblem, deep in the sublevel. The hinges groaned as it swung open, revealing a room lit by a single hanging bulb. The smell hit first: linen scorched by heat lamps, metal tang of antiseptic, and something faintly sweet, like syrup gone bad. In the center, a narrow bed was bolted to the floor. Straps waited on either side. A child, maybe 10, sat on the edge, her hair parted into 2 neat braids. She looked up when I entered, eyes clear but distant. They said I'd get to see my family again, she said quietly. But only after. Her wrists were already ringed with raw marks. Beside the bed, a tray gleamed with instruments, scissors, cloths, and a small glass vial of dark liquid. The nurse's logbook lay open on the desk. Today's entry was written in a looping, unhurried hand, subject prepared for spiritual correction. Bloodline confirmed. Return to origin scheduled. The child tilted her head, studying me. Will it matter if I get out? I couldn't answer. My chest felt hollow. Behind me, a voice rasped from the shadows, Elsie's. She stood in the doorway, hair wild, eyes wet. If you tell the world, she said, they'll burn for it. But they'll burn everyone. Families. Names. The ones who made it out, they'll never have peace. And if I don't? I asked. They'll just find another place. Another name. Her hands trembled as she held out 2 things, the ledger and a tin of matches. In that moment, I saw both futures. One where the doctrine's crimes became public, dragging every survivor into the light they'd been trained to fear. And another where the records were ash, the building locked, and the truth left to rot in the dark, safe for the living, buried for the dead. The child was watching me now, her eyes fixed and unblinking. You can't take me, she said softly. I belong here. That's what they told me. I reached for the matches. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped them. When I struck one, the sulfur flared in the stale air. The first page of the ledger curled, blackened, and bloomed into flame. I fed the rest into the metal basin until nothing remained but drifting flecks of red ash. Elsie stepped forward, helped me unstrap the girl, and led her toward the hall. Before I left, I placed 1 candle on the bed and lit it. The wax began to pool almost instantly. I shut the door and turned the key until the bolt slid home. Upstairs, the morning light had begun to seep through the shattered windows. Behind me, in the locked room, the candle still burned, its flame steady, unbothered by the draft. The papers called it an electrical fault. A spark in the chapel wiring, they said, which spread through the rotted beams and raced along the dry rafters. By the time the fire trucks arrived, St. Augustine's roof had collapsed inward, and the stone walls were too hot to approach. No one mentioned the locked doors in the sublevel. No one mentioned the smell of burning leather or the quiet faces of the men who carted away a single crate before the first hoses were turned on. The official statement from the diocese was brief: "It is with heavy hearts we confirm the total loss of the St. Augustine property. While we grieve the destruction of a historic building, we are grateful no lives were lost. The home's legacy of care will be remembered." But I knew better. In the county archive, the intake ledgers for institutions 1124 through 1142 vanished from the shelves. Microfilm reels went missing. Birth and death records that had once contained faint traces of names now carried only data unavailable. In the days after, construction crews cleared the blackened debris. Among the soot and rubble, they found nothing but warped nails, melted glass, and fragments of tile. At least, that's what the reports said. I know they missed something. When I returned alone, long after the trucks and crews had gone, the air was still sharp with smoke. I picked my way through the foundation's skeleton, past the chapel's cracked altar, to the place where the fifth veil door had been. The stone there was blackened but intact. Half buried in ash, I found it, a small silver locket, its hinge scorched but still functional. Inside, pressed flat between the frames, was a scrap of paper no bigger than a thumbnail. It carried only a number, written in the same neat hand I'd seen in the ledger, 1124. When I looked up, the wind caught the ash in a way that made it swirl into the shape of an open eye just for a moment before scattering into nothing. I turned to leave, my boots crunching over charred stone. And there, faint beneath the scent of smoke, came the whisper, I wasn't supposed to find this. 1.